Against the backdrop of President Donald Trump's controversial suggestions about annexing Canada and claiming access to its natural resources, a very specific concern has surged to the forefront of continental politics: fresh water. British Columbia's government recently announced that the United States has suspended ongoing negotiations regarding the Comprehensive Columbia River Treaty, citing the current administration's decision to review all of its international commitments and partnerships. What might sound like routine diplomatic housekeeping actually signals something far more significant unfolding beneath the surface. The United States is entering dangerous territory that very few analysts predicted would arrive this quickly. Across the American Southwest, water supplies are evaporating at a rate that climate scientists had projected would occur decades into the future, not right now. Major reservoirs are contracting to historically low levels. Agricultural operations are reducing planted acreage because irrigation water simply isn't available. Metropolitan areas from Phoenix to Las Vegas are desperately working to secure adequate supplies, not just for next year, but for the entire next decade. This mounting scarcity is now pushing American policymakers toward concepts that would have seemed completely unthinkable just a few years ago. The pivotal moment that fundamentally changed this conversation arrived when Donald Trump openly floated the idea that the United States should look northward toward Canada's enormous freshwater reserves as a potential solution. The comment itself was relatively brief and not particularly detailed, but the response it generated was anything but brief. Canadian officials reacted with immediate force, treating the suggestion not as a friendly proposal for cooperation, but as a direct threat to the country's sovereignty and national identity. That confrontation marked the beginning of a much larger and more complex story, one that extends far beyond water policy or infrastructure planning. What began as a crisis driven by drought conditions and accelerating climate change is rapidly transforming into a strategic, geopolitical question that could fundamentally redefine the relationship between two nations that have been among the world's closest allies for generations. The stakes are becoming clearer with each passing month, and the pressure is only intensifying on both sides of the border. The water emergency gripping the American West has been developing over the course of decades, but the velocity of the current deterioration has thrust the situation into what experts now categorize as genuine emergency status. The Colorado River, the lifeline that sustains more than 40 million people distributed across 7 states, has experienced devastating losses in flow volume over the past 2 decades. Climate researchers estimate that long-term reductions have reached approximately 20%, driven by a lethal combination of rising average temperatures, diminished mountain snowpack that historically fed the river system, and decades of chronic overuse by cities, farms, and industry. What was once regarded as one of the most dependable water systems anywhere in North America is now struggling to satisfy even the most basic levels of demand. Lake Mead, the massive reservoir that literally keeps the lights functioning and water flowing from Nevada through California, has fallen to the lowest levels ever documented in its entire operational history. Boat launch ramps now sit completely exposed on dry earth. Critical intake towers that feed water to cities are perilously close to being exposed above the waterline. The shoreline continues its relentless retreat month after month. These aren't temporary seasonal fluctuations that will correct themselves when winter arrives. They reveal a system that has been stretched catastrophically beyond its sustainable limits. Major urban centers like Phoenix and Las Vegas are attempting to adapt through massive investments in water recycling infrastructure and cutting-edge reuse technologies. California has committed billions of dollars toward constructing desalination facilities along its coastline and comprehensively upgrading irrigation systems to eliminate waste. Yet even with these ambitious and expensive projects moving forward, the fundamental gap between available supply and actual demand continues widening. The brutal mathematical reality is that the American West simply consumes more water than natural systems can possibly replenish under current climatic conditions. The agricultural sector adds yet another crushing layer of strain to this equation. California's Central Valley produces an enormous proportion of America's fruits, vegetables, and tree nuts, crops that feed not just the United States but export markets around the globe. But increasingly, fields are being left entirely unplanted because farmers cannot secure sufficient water allocations to sustain their operations through the growing season. Meanwhile, populations across desert states continue their steady expansion, intensifying pressure on systems that are already failing. This environmental and economic context explains precisely why Trump's casual remarks about Canadian water struck such a profound nerve across the entire continent. From the perspective of states throughout the American Southwest, the search for entirely new water sources has transitioned from being a theoretical long-term planning exercise to an immediate operational necessity. The crisis is structural in nature, worsening with each passing year, and shows no signs of natural correction. This harsh reality establishes the foundation for the international conflict that is now emerging. As drought conditions tighten their stranglehold on the American West, a single moment thrusts the issue from regional concern onto the international diplomatic stage. During a public appearance, Donald Trump suggested that the United States should seriously consider gaining access to Canada's vast freshwater reserves. "We have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snowcaps in Canada, and all pouring down," Trump stated, "and they have essentially a very large faucet." He presented it as straightforward pragmatism. If one region of the continent possesses abundant water while another faces severe shortages, then cooperative arrangements should naturally be part of the discussion. The comment wasn't accompanied by detailed policy specifications or legislative proposals, but it immediately captured widespread attention precisely because it emerged at a historical moment when water scarcity had evolved from manageable inconvenience to existential threat for millions of Americans. Trump's public statement effectively opened a door that policymakers in multiple states had been quietly examining behind closed doors for years. Officials in Arizona and Nevada had already conducted preliminary explorations into the technical feasibility of long-distance water transfers, including early conceptual designs for pipeline systems that would stretch from Canada's northern river systems all the way into the American Southwest. These ideas had circulated within technical planning committees and state water agencies for years, but they had never penetrated mainstream political discourse or public debate until Trump brought them into the open. In Washington, the comment triggered renewed interest in historical studies examining the concept of a North American water grid, an extensive network of interconnected pipelines designed to transport fresh water across international borders, functionally similar to how existing oil and natural gas infrastructure operates across the continent today. Policy think tanks and research institutions began circulating updated cost estimates that ranged from tens of billions to potentially hundreds of billions of dollars, depending on the scale and route configuration. Proponents argued that contemporary engineering capabilities could make such an ambitious system technically feasible, and that both nations might ultimately benefit from adopting a genuinely continental approach to water resource management. The concept spread rapidly through American media outlets and particularly resonated within conservative political networks. For many Americans, especially those living in states confronting shrinking reservoir levels, agricultural stress, and explosive population growth, Trump's suggestion sounded like simple common sense. To them, he had merely vocalized publicly what numerous officials had been contemplating privately for years. But that identical message landed with dramatically different impact north of the border. What registered as reasonable cooperation to many Americans immediately triggered fears of external pressure, loss of control, and escalating future demands among Canadians. This fundamental disconnect in perception set the stage for the sharp confrontation that would rapidly follow. The reaction throughout Canada materialized with remarkable speed and unmistakable clarity. Within hours of Trump's remarks gaining traction in American media, federal officials in Ottawa delivered an unequivocal response. Canada would not export its fresh water under any circumstances. No negotiations would be entertained. No pilot projects would be considered. No discussions about pipeline construction or long-term transfer agreements would take place. The federal government slammed the door shut completely and definitively. Prime Minister Mark Carney reinforced that position using direct, carefully chosen language designed to leave absolutely no room for misinterpretation. Standing before assembled reporters, Carney declared, "Canada's water is not for sale." The statement transcended ordinary policy announcement. It represented a line drawn across the entire debate, signaling unmistakably that water occupies a unique category that Canada categorically refuses to treat like timber exports, mineral resources, or energy commodities. Carney deliberately framed the issue as inseparable from the country's national identity and collective responsibility, something that belongs inherently to the land and its people, not to market forces or international trade mechanisms. His message resonated instantaneously across the country, generating rare political unity. In Canada, water carries profound emotional and cultural weight that extends far beyond its practical utility. Lakes, rivers, and wetlands fundamentally shape nearly every province's identity, and countless communities regard these water systems as the very heart of their cultural heritage and natural inheritance. The concept of exporting freshwater strikes many Canadians as tantamount to surrendering an essential piece of who they are as a people and a nation. Even individuals who rarely find themselves aligned on contentious national issues discovered themselves unified on this singular point, that water must remain Canadian. Such broad-based unity is extraordinarily rare in Canadian politics, and its emergence clearly demonstrates just how deeply this concern penetrates the national consciousness. Underlying Carney's forceful public statement lay a more complex calculation that extends beyond immediate economics or emotional attachment. Canadian policymakers harbor a strategic fear that once a country begins treating water as a tradable commodity, it establishes a precedent that becomes nearly impossible to reverse through future policy decisions. Trade agreements could potentially grant foreign partners substantial leverage over domestic decisions. International corporations might pursue legal claims to water rights. Market pressures could progressively push resource allocation decisions in directions that Canadians never intended or approved. From Carney's strategic perspective, the first sale, however small or carefully controlled, would mark the precise moment when genuine control begins irreversibly slipping away. This calculation explains why the Canadian response carried such uncompromising force. Protecting water is understood as synonymous with protecting sovereignty itself, a fundamental mindset that will shape every decision Canada makes going forward. Why water is different from everything else. Canada's absolute refusal to even discuss the possibility of water exports stems from calculations that run considerably deeper than political positioning or emotional reactions. The country controls approximately 1/5 of the planet's total freshwater reserves, a proportion unmatched by virtually any other major economy on Earth. That extraordinary scale transforms water from a simple natural resource into what strategists categorize as a critical national asset, something that protects the country's long-term security with the same significance as energy independence or food security. Canadian officials and policy analysts worry intensely that once freshwater becomes defined as an export commodity within international trade frameworks, it fundamentally stops being under purely Canadian control. Modern trade agreements have a documented tendency to convert shared resources into shared obligations that cannot easily be unwound. Foreign companies operating under trade treaty provisions could demand guaranteed long-term supply contracts. International partners might successfully claim legal rights under existing trade frameworks, particularly NAFTA provisions or their successor agreements. In practical terms, the moment water enters formalized international markets, Canada realistically risks losing the sovereign freedom to make independent decisions about how that water is allocated and utilized within its own territorial boundaries. Environmental concerns add yet another substantial layer to Canadian resistance. Much of Canada's freshwater flows through ecosystems that scientists characterize as remarkably fragile. Wetland complexes, river delta systems, and glacier-fed basins that are already experiencing significant stress from rising temperatures and increasingly unpredictable precipitation patterns. Large-scale diversions southward toward American consumers could substantially reduce river flow volumes, disrupt critical fish spawning populations, and fundamentally alter wetland ecosystems in ways that climate scientists warn may prove completely irreversible once initiated. Once water is permanently removed from a natural river system, it cannot simply be restored through policy reversal or engineering intervention. This irreversibility explains why Mark Carney framed his warning with such deliberate sharpness. From his strategic vantage point, permitting freshwater trade to begin, even on a limited experimental basis, could establish precedents that future Canadian governments would find themselves powerless to undo. Commercial contracts frequently outlive the political administrations that negotiate them. Market mechanisms could gradually reshape national resource priorities in ways that diverge from public interest. A resource that has always been treated as a public trust, held for the benefit of all Canadians, could, over time, become something substantially influenced by external economic forces and foreign policy considerations. Canada views protecting absolute control over its freshwater as synonymous with protecting its own future viability as a sovereign nation, a strategic mindset that only grows more entrenched and uncompromising as pressure from the United States continues building across the border. The American push intensifies. While Canada was systematically closing every conceivable door to water export discussions, pressure building within the United States was accelerating in precisely the opposite direction. The accelerating drought crisis pushed policymakers, independent analysts, and state governors to seriously revisit ambitious concepts that had seemed completely unrealistic just a few years earlier. Policy think tanks based in Washington began actively circulating comprehensive studies exploring the technical and financial feasibility of constructing large-scale pipeline systems that would physically link Canadian river systems to the chronically water-starved American Southwest. Some of these analytical proposals extended to hundreds of pages and included detailed cost projections reaching into the tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars, depending on route selection and system capacity. The conceptual plans borrowed heavily from existing oil and natural gas industry infrastructure, essentially imagining freshwater flowing across international borders through massive steel pipeline corridors in precisely the same manner that crude oil moves across North America today. Influential voices within the United States national security establishment began introducing an additional dimension to the argument. They warned explicitly that freshwater scarcity threatened to fundamentally undermine economic stability across multiple states and should therefore be elevated to the status of a formal national security priority requiring federal intervention. Without establishing long-term access to entirely new supply sources, they argued, America's agricultural productivity, electrical grid reliability, and continued population growth throughout the Southwest would all face severe existential risks. From this strategic perspective, a continental-scale pipeline network wasn't a luxury infrastructure project or an aspirational nice-to-have. It represented essential strategic planning to protect core national interests. Governors from Arizona, Nevada, and portions of California began quietly but consistently echoing this same fundamental message. With reservoir levels continuing their relentless decline and demand showing no signs of moderating, these state executives insisted that Canada represented the only realistic partner capable of providing a stable long-term water supply at the necessary scale. Even though direct bilateral negotiations weren't actively occurring, the political momentum and intellectual energy behind the concept kept building steadily within American policy circles. Editorial pages in major newspapers began publishing opinion pieces urging the federal government to think more ambitiously and seriously explore comprehensive North American solutions to continental water challenges. But from Canada's perspective, this growing movement felt less like an invitation to cooperation and more like the early stages of encroachment by a much more powerful neighbor. The fear among Canadian analysts was straightforward. Once the United States commits tens of billions of dollars to detailed pipeline engineering, environmental impact studies, and preliminary construction, walking away from the project becomes politically and economically difficult, regardless of Canadian objections. Economic momentum naturally transforms into diplomatic pressure, and sustained diplomatic pressure can eventually evolve into explicit demands backed by implicit threats. This mounting tension explains precisely why the story of North American water politics no longer remains confined to a bilateral dispute. It fits into a substantially larger global pattern that is crystallizing across multiple continents simultaneously. The global context. Water becomes weaponized. The escalating tension between the United States and Canada represents just one data point within a much broader transformation taking place across the entire planet. As climate disruption intensifies and global populations continue expanding, freshwater is rapidly becoming one of the most politically sensitive and strategically valuable resources on Earth. International organizations, including various United Nations agencies, have issued repeated warnings over the past decade that freshwater scarcity could emerge as the primary trigger of future interstate conflicts, potentially even more destabilizing than historical disputes over oil reserves or natural gas deposits. Multiple regions around the world are already demonstrating exactly how serious and immediate this strategic risk has become. In Southeast Asia, China maintains physical control over the upper portions of the Mekong River system, granting Beijing enormous unilateral influence over water supplies that sustain countries throughout the downstream basin. In South Asia, India and Pakistan continue their decades-long dispute over management of the Indus River, an absolute lifeline supporting millions of people on both sides of a militarized border. In Africa, Ethiopia's construction of the massive Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has generated profound tensions with Egypt and Sudan, raising genuine fears among diplomatic observers of potential military escalation if ongoing negotiations ultimately break down. These active disputes aren't isolated incidents or random anomalies. They represent early warning signals of a fundamental global shift in how nations perceive and respond to water scarcity. As freshwater grows increasingly scarce relative to demand, national governments move with remarkable speed to protect whatever supplies exist within their borders. Dam construction, river diversions, and upstream water controls progressively transform into instruments of strategic leverage between nations. North America is now following this exact same trajectory that has already manifested across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The United States and Canada have joined a rapidly growing list of regions where freshwater access is transitioning from a subject of technical cooperation into a source of geopolitical competition and potential confrontation. This broader global context fundamentally shapes every decision and calculation being made by policymakers on both sides of the Canadian-American border. The United States is systematically running out of viable alternatives, while Canada remains absolutely determined to maintain complete sovereign control over the single resource that anchors its long-term national security. Climate pressure is simultaneously squeezing both nations, transforming what might once have been routine technical discussions about river management or reservoir operations into profoundly sensitive geopolitical choices with lasting consequences. The decisions these two countries make over the next several years will substantially define how the entire North American continent adapts to a century where the most strategically important resource is no longer petroleum. It's fresh water, which inevitably leads to the fundamental question that neither country can avoid indefinitely. The question that demands an answer. If America's water crisis continues deepening along its current trajectory, will Canada realistically be able to maintain its absolute refusal to export fresh water? Or will mounting economic pressure, diplomatic tension, and the reality of sharing a continent with an increasingly desperate superpower eventually force a fundamental reshaping of the partnership between these two neighbors? The variables are complex, the stakes are enormous, and the timeline is compressing faster than anyone predicted even 5 years ago.